Hello, my name is Madison Peak, and for my POS465 debate topic, I picked debate number 4 and argued that states should surrender their sovereignty and comply to humanitarian international law. Now, in my opinion, the best way to understand something is to argue yourself, so I will be rebuttaling my own argument. And so my rebuttal is going to be on debate number 4, that states should not surrender their sovereignty to comply to international humanitarian law. So first I want to mention a couple of key things about humanitarian international law. International humanitarian law, it seeks to extend protection to a wide range of persons. And because humanitarian international law was originally the laws of war, and then later it also included the laws of armed conflict, the protection of people include treatment of prisoners of war, civilians in occupied territory, sick and wounded personnel, prohibited methods of warfare, and human rights in situations of conflict. I think here it is also important to note that human rights in situations of conflict under humanitarian international law is completely different and separate from international human rights as a whole, even though the book does discuss that recently they've kind of been construed to be very similar. So I think that the important thing here is that international law ranks above humanitarian international law, even though humanitarian international law is very coded and strict with many, many rules. So for these international law and international humanitarian law to really matter for these states, they have to have signed on a convention or a treaty, something that's binding like that. And so if a state does not sign this, then they don't need to surrender their sovereignty and comply because they never promised anything. But it's really unique is that there's a lot of varieties of enforcement for humanitarian international law. And that's just really interesting to me because I feel like a lot of these groups or treaties and conventions, when there is enforcement, it's almost like a slap on the wrist. And these seem to be much more strict. Now, the reason I originally had my argument that states should surrender their sovereignty is due to a quote on page 919 in our textbook that said, "Since the role is so central to the enforcement and working of humanitarian law, it is a disadvantage for it to be subject to state sovereignty and consent." Well, nothing can happen unless there's consent between the two parties or more that are involved in the conflict, and consent is not always given. But because according to state legal theory, each state is sovereign and equal. They all have their own governments and can do what they want with their citizens, which I believe is one reason that we have the immense amount of refugees that we have, because they're fleeing so that they can come to a better and safer place. And another thing about state sovereignty is that it's defined by the legal and normative framework and states have the final authority over their territory and citizens. And so this is not something that any state or person is going to want to give up. So I do believe that humanitarian international law does not require states to give up their sovereignty to comply, because you would assume that states have the best interest of their government, of their peoples, of their economy at stake, and so that they rightfully comply to this. But if they weren't willing to comply, then they could go through the variety of methods of enforcement, or at the very end be removed from the treaty, from the convention that they had previously signed. But states are going to do what they want. They have the power to do what they want. They are sovereign. And if they had signed a convention or a treaty, then they have to follow that. That was their choice. Or they can remove themselves and choose not to follow it. But I don't think that this is an argument where sovereignty needs to be surrendered. Thank you.